The micro-party members in this current Senate have proved a huge headache for the Abbott-Turnbull government. They've been labelled ferals and likened to the weirdos in the infamous cantina bar scene in Star Wars, but they can't be dismissed so easily. They've blocked billions of dollars worth of government budget measures, and now they're threatening that if the government presses ahead with Senate voting reforms that could see many of them out of the parliament, they will form a coalition to run in lower house seats. Here's political correspondent Sabra Lane.
Just making sure my parents are all right.
Big handshakes, broad smiles and Bibles, as well as happy families, radiated at the second Turnbull ministry swearing in this morning.
I think the military's machine guns work that fast.
This is the fourth ministry since the coalition was elected in 2013. And this is the man who's threatening to make it the last coalition swearing in at Government House for some time.
My mother has threatened to get me a bomber jacket with Preference Whisperer written on the back. I said, no, don't do that, Mum. Actually, I want to become an ISM. Could you help me do that?
Self-assured, Glenn Drury certainly is. He was dubbed the Preference Whisperer in 2013 after he helped a number of micro-parties win seats in the Senate, like the motoring parties Ricky Muir and Family First's Bob Day, even though they only won a small number of first preference votes.
I don't like threats in politics. I would rather operate with a handful of honey than a face full of vinegar, but I can't control what these parties are going to do. I can advise them. I can suggest ways that they can be effective. But I would say that the government and the Greens are threatening the Australian people by denying them a means of entering the political process.
Some people have described them as men running their own video game, where they're out there trying to crunch the numbers, trying to rearrange the players according to preference deals, and then hoping that it's their party that gets elected when the votes are finally counted.
Mr Drury is talking tough because he and the micro-parties believe the Australian government's about to change the way Australians vote for senators. And the consequence for the micro-parties will be electoral extinction here in the Senate crossbench. So they're threatening a campaign of their own. If the government presses ahead, they're threatening to run candidates in lower house marginal coalition seats. Not only that, they'll preference Labor ahead of the Liberal and National parties. The Preference Whisperer has in his pocket a hit list of coalition seats.
Now, these are the seats that various minor parties have mentioned to me. Petrie in Queensland, Capricornia, Lyons, Hindmarsh, Banks, Eden Monero, Macarthur, Lindsay, Page, Deakin, Corangamite, Latrobe, Brisbane, Burt and Dunkley and Dixon.
The motorbike riding Senator David Lionhelm, a senator for the Liberal Democrats, says his party is considering joining forces with other minor parties in the campaign to topple government MPs. And they've also got Greens MP Adam Bandt in their sights.
There is one other seat that we would also look at, and that's the seat of Adam Bandt in Melbourne. His party is also pushing this idea. And if minor parties ran in that seat and also preferenced him last, he would probably lose it.
It would just entrench the Greens as the permanent balance of power party in the Senate. So whichever party won office in the lower house, they would have to deal with the Greens in the Senate, in the upper house.
So what's it all about? Remember those supersized Senate ballot papers in 2013? Most people vote above the line in the Senate, especially when confronted with ballot papers like this. When someone votes above the line, the political party they voted for decides how their preferences are spread, and most voters don't know how they're distributed. They're known as group voting tickets. Critics say they've allowed the micro-parties to game the system to get candidates elected to this place. A bipartisan parliamentary committee recommended they be scrapped. Yet the government's hesitated in taking action because they don't want to provoke the crossbench senators. And what's complicated the issue recently is that Labor is now divided on what to do.
Well, when you're threatened with annihilation, I suppose you can't blame some of the minor parties from wanting to say, well, look, please consider that these minor parties could have quite a big influence on the outcome of a lot of those marginal seats.
How many are will agree to participate, we don't know at this point. Leadership of it, well, I guess the infamous preference whisperer Glenn Drury first raised it, but I must confess I had been thinking, well, what could we do in the way of an incentive to the coalition to not agree with the Greens and Xenophon to change the voting system to put us all out of business. So I had been thinking along somewhat similar lines.
The Greens question Mr Drury's motives.
It's worth looking at who is running this argument. It's worth looking at who is saying they'll do this, is that it's people who are worried. It appears that they'll lose their business model for micro parties, where you run candidates, you get various parties, and these are not parties that are based on members who are out there putting forward their policies. It's about doing backroom deals, harvesting preferences, and then looking at the end of the day, who wins the lottery.
I, Matthias Hubert Paul Cormann.
Matthias Cormann was sworn in this morning as Special Minister of State. He now has the responsibility for Senate voting reform. He says the government's not made a decision yet.
Yes, I've spoken to the Greens, I've also spoken to Labour, I've spoken to independents, I've spoken to people outside the Parliament, essentially helping me finalise my views and so that I can make sensible recommendations and provide sensible advice to the Prime Minister and to the Cabinet.
Bill Shorten appears to be wiping his hands of it.
What the micro parties do is up to the micro parties. But I do think that the government needs to explain what it wants to do and why it wants to do it.
Given quotas for Senate seats are halved in double dissolution elections and talk of a July poll is gaining momentum, there might be some urgency to getting it done before Parliament rises at the end of next month. Without it, the crossbench numbers could swell.
Political correspondent Sarah Lane.